Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular halacha shiur. Our topic for this evening is, and next week as well, our topic is sleeping on Rosh Hashanah. And as with every other tiny corner of halacha, investigating the sources dealing with this issue will reveal fundamental principles which have broad application throughout the length and breadth of Torah. Before we begin looking at the sources, let me point out that if you want to ask a question, feel free to type your question on chat. I will see it on my screen, and then I can incorporate the answer into the ongoing class. I know that not all of the participants are from English-speaking countries, so for those who are from other countries, let me point out, on peut poser des questions en français, se pueden hacer preguntas también en español, también en portugués. Je kan ook vragen in het Nederlands stellen. I have a number of other languages if you want to correspond in another language. Okay, that said, let's get the sources on the screen. I remember how to do this. Click over here. Voila. Sleeping on Rosh Hashanah. There is a Talmudic passage which we're about to look at in the Yerushalmi. I think everyone knows that the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, predates the Bavli, predates the Babylonian Talmud, and has some material in it which does not appear in the Bavli as well. Let's see what the Talmud Yerushalmi might imply, maybe implies about sleeping on Rosh Hashanah. Amar Rav Levi. This is the text of the Yerushalmi, and incidentally, I am not a very good typist, and therefore I make mistakes when I type, but you always have on the screen or on the source sheets, which you can download, you always have the exact precise source from which I drew the texts, so you can always look them up and see what my typographical errors are and see the broader context there. Amar Rav Levi. Rav Levi says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, he quotes a verse from the book of Psalms, and again, I'm not going to bother mentioning exactly where in the book of Psalms it is, because you have that on the screen if you want to look it up. V'hu yishpot tevel b'tzedek. He, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God will judge the world justly. Yadin l'umim b'meisharim, and he will judge the people. He will judge the nations straight, in a straightforward way. Based on this verse in the book of Psalms, in Sefer Tehillim, Rav Levi says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu dan et Yisrael bayom. After all, the verse talks about two kinds of divine judgment. The first kind of divine judgment is judging the world justly. The second kind of judgment mentioned in the second half of the verse is judging the nations, the non-Jews. Oh, so there must be some difference between the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu, between the way God judges the Jewish people and the way God judges other people, other peoples of the world. There must be some difference. And Rav Levi says the difference is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges the Jewish people during daytime. B'shah shehem asukim b'mitzvahs, because during the daytime, the Jews are awake and they're busy doing mitzvot, and since the Jews are busy doing mitzvot, that's the good time to judge them. They'll be judged more favorably in the eyes of God because they're doing mitzvahs during the day. Unlike at night when everyone's asleep. At Umot, the nations, all the other nations of the world besides the Jewish people, Balayla, they get judged at night. b'shah shehen b'teilin min mitzvos, at a time when they are not dealing, not engaged in any mitzvahs because they're asleep. Well, if the judgment of the Jewish people is dafka, specifically during the day, because we don't want, it's not good when God judges you when you're asleep. If it's not good when God judges you when you're asleep, and that's why God judges you during the day, that implies, doesn't actually say, but that implies that it's not a good idea to sleep on Rosh Hashanah. The day of judgment should be a day when you are awake, dealing with mitzvahs, engaged in mitzvahs, so that you can be judged favorably by a Kodesh Baruch Hu. So here we have a passage in the Yerushalmi which implies, but does not flat out say, that sleep on Rosh Hashanah is bad. Now, where there is a conflict between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, and there are plenty of examples of conflict between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, it's in general the Bavli which prevails. It's the Bavli which was accepted by Am Yisrael. It's the Babylonian Talmud, which Jewish communities all over the world, well, back in those days, Jews were not so spread out, but Jewish communities all over the world embraced the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, as being definitive, and therefore where there's a conflict between the two, it's the Bavli, it's the Babylonian view which views this rule of the Babylonian Talmud having precedence over the Yerushalmi when there's a conflict. This rule applies to halachic matters and not to matters of minhag. Remember, halacha is halacha, and minhag is minhag, and never the twain shall meet. You always have to distinguish between what is halacha and what is minhag. Halacha is obligatory. You have to do this, you have to do that, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. Minhagim, on the other hand, are practices that people engage in, things that people do, or things that people refrain from doing, positive and negative minhagim, but they're not actually obligatory. As far as minhagim are concerned, there's a big divide, a big division regarding the minhagim in the Bavli and the minhagim in the Yerushalmi. The divide works as follows. The minhagim, not halacha, but the minhagim of the Yerushalmi in the course of generations largely became the minhagim of the Ashkenazim. And the minhagim in the Bavli, in the course of generations, eventually became the minhagim of the Sfaradim. Right? The division, such as it is, between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim occurred centuries after the close of the Talmud. But historically speaking, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael, whose Talmud was the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jews of Eretz Yisrael went to live in Italy. If you look at it from the point of view of the Roman Empire, from the point of view of the Roman Empire, the land of Israel was a Roman province. But if you look at it from the Jewish point of view, the Jewish community in Italy was a colony of Eretz Yisrael. The Jews went from Eretz Yisrael to Italy. From Italy, in the course of generations, the Jews migrated northward into France, and then westward into Germany and into Eastern Europe. And the Ashkenaz Jews have their historical roots in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, it's not surprising that the minhagim of the Talmud Yerushalmi correspond very closely with the minhagim of the Ashkenaz Jews. Jews from Babylonia, on the other hand, colonized. I don't know if that's a highly charged political term nowadays. We probably shouldn't be speaking about colonization. The Jews of Babylonia did business, commerce with North Africa, and the North African Jewish communities were originally founded by Jews, Soharim, merchants, Jewish merchants who came from Babylonia. And in the course of generations, the Jews of North Africa moved north into Spain, and then with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, eventually scattered all over the world. The Sephardic Jews have their historical roots in Babylonia. It is therefore not surprising that the minhagim of the Bavli, of the Babylonian Talmud, correspond largely with the minhagim of the Sephardim. Where there are differences, and truth be told, there are not a lot of examples, but where there are differences in minhag between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, well, these are reflected in differences between the minhagim of Sfaradim and Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim largely following the Yerushalmi, and Sfaradim usually following the Bavli, and therefore it is not surprising, well, it should not be surprising for you to learn that this minhag to refrain from sleep on Rosh Hashanah is an Ashkenaz practice. It is the Ashkenazim who have this problem with sleep on Rosh Hashanah, and from now on, there's going to be one exception coming up, but from now on, all except for the one exception we're going to see are going to be from now on Ashkenaz sources dealing with sleep on Rosh Hashanah. This is not an issue which comes up in Sephardic practice. Let's go one step further. The Bach. His name was Rav Yoel Sirkis, one of the great 17th century rabbis, Eastern Europe, Lithuania. I can't get more Ashkenazi than that. And he wrote this commentary on the Torah, extraordinarily influential. And as in all of my classes, I'm going to present to you only the most important opinions, only the most influential sources through the generations. On a few occasions, when I'm going to present to you a source which is not so influential, I'm going to make it quite clear that it's a non-influential source. But the Bach, oh, he was important. That had vast influence on the thinking of subsequent generations. Let's see what he says. Katav b'sefer Rabbi Yehoshua ibn Shurib. Now, he's quoting a sefer, which in truth I've never even held in my hands, but I was able to find a digital version of it in Otzara Hochma. He's quoting a sefer by this 13th century Spanish rabbi, Rabbi Yehoshua ibn Shu'aib. He was a disciple of the Rashba. Admittedly, not one of the most influential disciples, and admittedly, not one of the most well-known disciples. Indeed, except for this one quotation that we're about to read from this book of Rabbi Yehoshua ibn Shu'aib, you're not going to find any other references to him in halachic literature at all. In any event, he quotes the Rambam. The Rambam says, and the Rambam was a heavyweight, Rambam says, B'tkiya shofar yesh remez ladin uru yeshenim mitar damaschem. Rambam says flat out in the Mishnah Torah that the blast of the shofar is a wake-up message, and these are exactly the words of the Rambam. Shofar is a wake-up message. Uru yeshenim mitar damaschem. Oh, you sleepy Jews, wake up and do tshuva. Wake up and repent. Well, what exactly is that supposed to mean when Rambam said that the shofar is a wake-up call? Wake up and do tshuva. Wake up and repent. The explanation, according to this disciple of the Rajba in the 13th century in Spain. Ritzono Lamar, he means to say as follows. Ki hasha'at tzricha ha'ara. The time of Rosh Hashanah requires wakefulness. You can't be asleep on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah demands wakefulness. Like it says in the verse, Im yitaka shofar be'ir v'am lo yeharadu. If the shofar is blown in the city, the people are not going to get excited. Hearing the sound of the shofar will wake everyone up. If you hear the shofar blowing in town, it's like hearing an air raid siren. You know that something very serious is going on. If the shofar is blown in town, it's like an air raid siren and has to wake you up. The Yerushalmi therefore learns as follows, and he's going to quote a passage in the Yerushalmi which is totally unknown and not available in any known manuscript of the Yerushalmi, surely not in the printed versions of the Yerushalmi. He's going to quote a passage in the Yerushalmi that he's the only one in the world who ever knew about. Here's the passage in the Yerushalmi. Asur la'adam lishon b'Rosh Hashanah. According to the Yerushalmi, as quoted by Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shu'aib, he had some manuscript, I suppose, in which it was written in the Yerushalmi that it is prohibited to sleep on Rosh Hashanah. Kedama Hasam, like it says, Eich bar nash tedamich b'Rosh Hashanah, b'Rosh Hashanah, v'oskim b'dinei. How is it possible for someone to sleep on Rosh Hashanah when you are being judged by the heavenly court, by HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How can you possibly sleep when it's such a tense moment? Oh, furthermore, Yesh Lamar ki hu muratzlut. Furthermore, sleeping will make people think, sleeping will imply that you are lazy. K'tiksiv, as it says in another verse, V'yikra v'elav Rav HaChovel, in the book of Yonah, the captain of the ship said, Ma lacha ni'adam, why are you guys sleeping? Remember the story in the book of Yonah, the ship was in a storm and was going to sink. And the captain of the ship went around saying, you guys, why are you asleep? Wake up and help bail the water. Kum, kra el Elokecha, wake up. Pray to God, at least pray to save us from the storm. Maybe God will save us and we won't be lost at sea. Well, this is the end of the quotation of Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shu'aib as quoted by the Bach, who in turn quotes this passage in the Yerushalmi, which is otherwise unknown. So we have on the previous screen a passage in the Yerushalmi which vaguely implies, but does not say, that sleep is bad on Rosh Hashanah. So it's perfectly understandable how it became a minhag among the Ashkenazim in many Ashkenaz communities not to sleep on Rosh Hashanah. Now we see a new passage in the Yerushalmi in which it's a flat-out halacha, prohibited to sleep on Rosh Hashanah, but this passage in the Yerushalmi appears in no printed edition and in no known manuscript, which casts a big doubt on whether or not it's a legitimate passage or not. At this point, the Bach, who's telling this whole story, the Bach, who's telling us what he found in this book by Rabbi Yeshua ibn Shu'aib, who in turn found this Yerushalmi passage somewhere, who knows where he found it. Now the Bach continues and says, Maharam, the great Rav Meir of Rothenburg, he was one of the most important Ashkenaz poskim of the Middle Ages, one of the most important Ashkenaz Rishonim. Hayaragil Lishon, Kamo b'Shah Yom Tov. He used to sleep on Rosh Hashanah, just like on every other Yom Tiv. After all, Hashena Mishu Bachas, sleep is a way of enjoying Yontif. Yontif. There's a chiyuv, simcha, when we have to do what we can to enjoy Yom Tov. And if you're tired, sleep is the way to go. And the Maharam, one of the most influential Ashkenaz authorities of the Middle Ages, he, of course, took a nap on every Yom Tov, and that includes Rosh Hashanah. So, halacha, it's not a halacha prohibition to sleep. It's a minhag, a practice, not exactly obligatory, which flows out of an implication, and not a very strong implication, from the Talmudic passage, the Yerushalmi passage we began with. Now let me just point out in passing at this time a footnote about the Maharetz Chayes. Maharetz Chayes is one of my favorites. He was he was so important as a 19th century rabbi. He died very young, and although he left us a dozen very important svarim, together with extensive notes, commentaries on the whole of the Gemara, the whole of Shas, the whole Gemara, and indeed he's one of the few 19th century rabbis whose comments on the Gemara are so important that they're printed in the back of every standard edition of the Gemara. He points out as follows. There are many passages in the Yerushalmi, Shahayu Nochech, which were available, Le'einei HaRishonim, which were available to the eyes of the medieval authorities. The Rishonim had many manuscripts of the Yerushalmi, including much material, Shenevad Mitanu, which has since been lost, and we no longer have it. Dugmaot Atzig, and he said, I'll give you a few examples, and he goes on for a few pages with examples of Yerushalmi passages quoted by the Rishonim, quoted by the great medieval authorities, and they apparently had manuscripts which are no longer extant, and those passages have been lost. So perhaps this Yerushalmi passage, perhaps it's one of those. Perhaps. Who knows? What do we have up till now? We have a minhag of Yerushalmi origin, which was embraced in many Ashkenaz communities, not to sleep on Rosh Hashanah. And we have this Yerushalmi halachic passage, which is a little bit shaky because it's only known from this one quotation. Now, how does all this play out as far as the opinions of the great poskim, the great halachic authorities are concerned? The Darchei Moshe, everyone knows that the Shulchan Aruch was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. And everyone knows that Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, at the beginning of the 16th century, everyone knows that Rabbi Yosef Karo was of Sephardic. He was from Spain. He was born in Spain. Born in Spain before the expulsion, and composed the Shulchan Aruch after the expulsion, when he was already in Tzfat, in Eretz Yisrael. But he was Sephardi, and therefore, it's not surprising, is it, that the decisions in the Shulchan Aruch, where there are disagreements amongst the authorities, the decisions in the Shulchan Aruch tend strongly to favor Sephardic authorities. Oh, it's not surprising. Well, when the Shulchan Aruch was published, and printing was just beginning in these days, in the days of Shulchan Aruch, printing was just getting started. When the Shulchan Aruch was printed, it became quite influential throughout the Jewish world, including in Ashkenaz centers. And Rav Moshe Isserles, great rabbi of Poland in the early 16th century, added notes to the Shulchan Aruch, added notes where the Ashkenaz authorities disagreed with the decisions, the conclusions in the Shulchan Aruch. And the Rav Moshe Isserles formulated the Ashkenaz objections to the Shulchan Aruch in two separate books. The first book we're going to look at is the Darchei Moshe, which was written in in the form of a lengthy commentary on the Torah, where at length he presents the Ashkenaz disagreements with the Sephardic text of Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch. Then that all got summarized very briefly in notes which he added to the Shulchan Aruch itself. And today, in all standard editions of the Shulchan Aruch, those notes of Rav Moshe Isserles are published together, printed together with the Shulchan Aruch. You can tell who's who. The Rabbi Yosef Karo was always printed in block letters. The notes of Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ashkenaz notes, are always printed in Rashi script, so you see instantaneously which is which. In any event, in the Darchei Moshe, in his longer exposition of Ashkenaz positions differing from the decisions of the Shulchan Aruch, he wrote as follows: the Yerushalmi de Rosh Hashanah, in the Yerushalmi, and he's referring exactly to the mysterious passage on the previous screen, which does not exist in any known manuscript of the Yerushalmi. In that mysterious passage in the Yerushalmi quoted by Rabbi Yeshua ibn Sharib, it says, "My ahai man damich, anyone who sleeps, b'Rosh Hashanah on Rosh Hashanah, damich mazle, your mazel, your lucky star, is also going to go to sleep. That means you're going to have bad fortune. Your fortune will not smile on you if you sleep on Rosh Hashanah. Your spectral, your celestial star will not shine. V'lachein, and therefore, nizharim shelo lishon b'Rosh Hashanah, and therefore it is customary to refrain from sleep on Rosh Hashanah. That is an Ashkenaz practice, to refrain from sleeping on Rosh Hashanah. And then he reformulates, Rav Moshe Isserles, and reformulates the same thing again, just in a brief formulation in the notes on the Shulchan Aruch. And here is the text of the Ashkenaz notes on the Shulchan Aruch, Nohagim. It is common practice, and of course he means in Ashkenaz communities. Nohagim means Ashkenazim have the practice, not a halachic requirement, but a practice, a minhag of Ashkenazim, lo lishon b'Rosh Hashanah, not to sleep on Rosh Hashanah, based on that passage in Yerushalmi. Minhag nachon hu. This is a correct practice. Now, these three words, a little bit mysterious. What on earth did he mean by these three words that he added? Minhag nachon hu. This is a practice of the Ashkenazim, and it is a proper practice. It's correct. It's praiseworthy. It's commendable. It's advisable. It's all kinds of good things. Not quite the same as saying obligatory. Let me assure you. Yeah, we're going to talk about the second day later. The second day, next week. We're going to talk about the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Let me assure you that the Ramah, like all the other rabbis in the world, have a very rich vocabulary if they want to say something is prohibited. Hebrew language has a rich semantic field for prohibitions. He knows how to say something is prohibited if he wishes to. Sleeping on Rosh Hashanah is not prohibited. It's good, it's correct, it's proper, it's praiseworthy, it's commendable, it's all kinds of good things, but that's not quite the same as saying obligatory. It's not actually prohibited. It's a praiseworthy minhag in Ashkenaz communities. Now, why on earth does he add these three words? Well, why doesn't he just say, back in those days, uh, uh, they didn't have typewriters, of course, surely not word processors. Of course, back in those days, the Ramah wrote everything by hand. And he knew that his Talmidim, his disciples, were going to be copying by hand everything he wrote. Printing was just beginning in those days. And when it came to the printed word, setting type was very expensive in those days. Every word counted. And not only rabbis, but everyone in those days made the greatest effort to be as concise as possible and not to add anything to the text which is not really very important. Because if it is not so important, you're just placing an unreasonable burden on the copyists or on the printers. It's going to raise the price significantly. This is the reason why rabbinic texts are chock full of abbreviations. Indeed, I keep a dictionary of abbreviations on my desk. There are so many abbreviations in rabbinic literature. Sometimes I get stumped, and I have to look up the abbreviation. Abbreviations were so common, so as to reduce the length of the text, to make it easier to copy. And if it's going to be set in print, then the book would be cheaper. When I type these texts, I personally make an effort to open up all the abbreviations and to type out the words in full. There's no reason why nowadays I should burden you with trying to figure out what the abbreviations are. Nowadays we have no need for being so concise. Why did the Ramah emphasize that the minhag is commendable? Why did he not just say what the minhag is? I'm going to propose to you now the answer to this question, and the proof is going to be coming later. The solution to this question runs along the following lines. The minhagim, the Ashkenaz practices of the Ramah, divide into two categories. There are minhagei shev va'al ta'aseh, Ashkenaz minhagim to refrain from doing certain things. For example, an Ashkenaz minhag to refrain from eating rice on Pesach. That's a negative minhag, a thou shalt not. Well, not actually a halacha, but a minhag, a practice to not do something, not eat rice on Pesach. On the other hand, there are also minhagim, which are kum va'aseh, minhagim, Ashkenaz minhagim, to do things. And presently, we're going to be mentioning the Ashkenaz minhag of going to the river or a body of water on Rosh Hashanah for tashlich. We're going to be talking about that in a few minutes. And we're going to see that there is inevitably, in every single case of minhag of the Ramah, there's always some tension. There's always some severe tension between the different kinds of minhag and different kinds of halacha. Even though there's not a lot of justification for a certain minhag, in fact, the people are doing it, and that's why the Ramah all begins with no hagim. In fact, the fact on the ground is that the people are refraining from sleep on Rosh Hashanah. That is the practice which represents reality. That's what's going on in the communities. And not only is there nothing wrong with it, but it's commendable, it's praiseworthy. And we're going to see in a few minutes why you might think it's not commendable at all, but the Ramah is giving it his stamp of approval. Okay, what have we learned up to this point? There's an Ashkenaz practice to refrain from sleeping on Rosh Hashanah, and the source is this Yerushalmi, and the Ramah has given his stamp of approval to the minhag, calling it Nahon, correct, proper, justifiable, praiseworthy, commendable, not quite obligatory. Now we go a century further down. I'm going more or less in chronological order. A century later, we come to the 18th century. The Elia Rabbah, he was in Eastern Europe. He was Ashkenazi, 18th century, and he wrote this halachic commentary where he begins quoting the Ramah, exactly the words we saw on the previous screen. It is a practice in Ashkenaz communities not to sleep on Rosh Hashanah, and the minhag is nachon, is correct and proper. Now, Elia Rabbah, after having quoted the minhag of the Ramah to refrain from sleeping on Rosh Hashanah, after he's quoted the Ashkenaz practice not to sleep on Rosh Hashanah, he then says, "V'halavush hishmital." The lavush is silent on this issue. And this is very significant. The lavush, the sefer he's quoting now, was written by Rav Mordechai Yaffa. Rav Mordechai Yaffa was the leading disciple of the Ramah. And the lavush, Rav Mordechai Yaffa, the leading disciple of the Ramah, he wrote this sefer lavush, which is a exposition of all of the opinions of the Ramah, and a lengthy exposition of all the halachot which are in the Shulchan Aruch. And indeed, whenever one encounters a phrase in the Ramah, whenever one encounters a passage in the Ramah on the Shulchan Aruch which is difficult to understand, the first place to look for an explanation is in the lavush. How does his great disciple, the Ramah, how does his great disciple, Rav Mordechai Yaffa, formulate it? But in this case, Rav Mordechai Yaffa, the great disciple of the Ramah, is totally silent on this issue of sleeping, unlike every other passage where he slavishly copies over and explains the practices of the Ramah. In this case, exceptionally, he omits the practice of refraining from sleep on Rosh Hashanah. Ze omer dasheni. This requires some explanation. If in every other situation the lavush slavishly follows the opinions of his great master, the Ramah, why in this one case, exceptionally, did he simply omit talking about it? Merely, it seems to me, the Elia Rabbah says, svirale, it must be that the lavush thought in accord with Shari. The Ramah, the lavush must have thought it simply permitted to sleep on Rosh Hashanah. Kamosha Katava Bach, just like the Bach wrote in the name of the Maharam Rottenberg, who was accustomed to sleep on Rosh Hashanah like every other Yom Tov. It must be that the disciple of the Ramah, the lavush, rejected the opinion of his teacher, rejected the opinion of the Ramah, and paskened, embraced the opinion of the Bach, embraced the practice of the great Maharam Rottenberg, not only permitting sleep on Rosh Hashanah, but approving of it. It's part of Simchas Yontif, part of rejoicing, part of enjoying Yontif. Of course, if you're tired, you should go to sleep. Next time you hear someone say, "Oh, of course, the disciple of the rabbi has to follow the opinions of that rabbi," you'll remember this example of the lavush apparently rejecting the teaching of his master apparently rejecting the teaching of the Ramah, and I can assure you, this is one of a huge number of examples in the history of halachic literature, beginning in the Mishnah and Gemara, where disciples rejected the teachings of their masters, the teachings that they were taught from the previous generation. There are plenty of examples of that. Indeed, it says in Pirkei Avot, it says, "Le'olam have mitabek be'afar raglehem shel talmidei hachamim." You should always think of yourself as rolling around in the dust at the feet of the rabbinic scholars. This is normally understood as meaning, be humble. Think of yourself as dust in front of the great rabbis and embrace their words. That's the way it's normally understood. But Reb Chaim of Volozhin, a disciple from the Beit Midrash of the Gra, one of the most influential Ashkenaz thinkers of the late 18th century, he wrote in his commentary on Pirkei Avot, on that Mishnah, he wrote, the meaning of the passage is just the opposite. La'olam have mitabek. You should always dust yourself. And you know, in Hebrew, the word avak does indeed mean dust, but in Hebrew, the word ma'avak also means struggle. And therefore, Reb Chaim of Volozhin understood the Mishnah as meaning, La'olam yitabek adam, one must always struggle, not roll around in the dust. Well, in English, there's an expression for a fight. In English, there's an expression, dust up. A dust up is a fight. The Reb Chaim understood the Mishnah as meaning the disciple, every disciple, must struggle against his master, against his teacher, and force his teacher to prove that what he is teaching is correct, force the teacher to convince us that what he is teaching is correct, and if he cannot prove it, if he cannot convince us, we will, of course, not accept the words of the teacher. That's exactly what's going on in the relationship between the Ramah and his leading disciple, the Lavush, Reb Mordechai Yaffa. The Ramah said, it's commendable, praiseworthy, really a great practice to refrain from sleeping on Rosh Hashanah. The disciple, apparently, did not accept that. V'chein katav b'Magen Avram. And further, in the Magen Avram, 17th century Poland, his name was Rabbi Avram Gombiner, but the name is hardly known in yeshiva circles. If you talk about the opinion of Rav Avram Gombiner, no one's going to know who you're talking about. But if you talk about, if you call him by the name of his sefer, the Magen Avram is the most important, or anyone's short list of most important commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch ever. It's very, very important. The Magen Avram quotes the Arizal. Magen Avram quotes the Arizal. Let me explain to you what's going on here. The Magen Avram wrote this passage that we're quoting in the 17th century in Poland. Prior to the Magen Avram, halacha was halacha, and Kabbalah was Kabbalah. There's halacha, and there's Jewish mysticism. And there were two separate fields of study with hardly any interface, hardly any interconnections between them. Halacha was the field of study that told you what to do and what not to do. Kabbalah was a field of study that taught you how the universe works, how the mitzvot interact and influence the universe for understanding the world we live in. Study Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. for learning what to do or what not to do, study halacha. And there was hardly any connection between these two fields until the 17th century, until the Magen Avram, whom we're quoting now, who was the first of the rabbis to systematically introduce Kabbalistic thinking, mystical thinking into halachic discourse. And once the Magen Avram, the most important, or on anyone's short list of most important commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch, once he systematically incorporated the thinking of the great mystics in halachic discourse, well, subsequently, just about everyone else jumped on that bandwagon, and that's become standard, more or less standard practice everywhere. In any event, the Arizal said as follows: the great Arizal, the greatest all-time Jewish mystic from 16th century Tzfat in the Upper Galilee. He said, Mutar lishan achar hatzot. It's permissible to sleep on Rosh Hashanah after midday. Midday is when the sun is exactly halfway between sunrise and sunset. When the sun is exactly directly overhead, that's midday. That's chatzot hayom. After that, on Rosh Hashanah, the Arizal said it's okay to sleep, and the Magen Avram quotes this opinion because he embraces it. Kvar nitorer hamalach al yedei atfilot v'atkiyot. Your guardian angel on high is already woken up by your prayers and the blowing of the shofar, and therefore you don't have to worry about sleep after chatzot hayom, after midday. Now, this is a mystical idea, which we're going to explain in greater detail in just a few minutes. We'll see some sources which explain this in greater detail. But if the Arizal had no problem with sleep on Rosh Hashanah afternoon means after midday, after astronomical midday, then of course that has to be okay. Lefi gam hayoshev batel kiyoshin dami. But since the whole problem of sleep has to do with your relationship with the Malach, your relationship with the angel on high, it's not actually the sleep which is the problem. After all, as the Arizal taught us, by midday, the blowing of the shofar and the prayers have already been done, and therefore, by midday, there's no longer a problem of sleep. Sleeping in and of itself is not the problem. Rather, the problem is not engaging in prayer. While you're asleep, you're not doing anything prayerful. While asleep, you're not praying. While asleep, you're not engaged in mitzvot. While sleeping, you're not learning Torah. While sleeping, you're just, from the Torah point of view, you're just wasting time. Oh, but that's important only to a certain point during the day. That's important only until midday, because by then the tefillot, the prayers, and the blowing of the shofar have done their job. But prior to midday, sleeping is wrong, and the reason it's wrong is because you're not engaging in mitzvahs, and therefore it's wrong just to be Yoshev Batel. Therefore, it's wrong just to waste time. Rosh Hashanah is a time which must be devoted to prayer, to tshuva, to kapara, and doing anything else is batel, a waste of time, and therefore sleep is just one example of wasting your time on Rosh Hashanah when you're supposed to be engaged in prayer, in Torah study, in mitzvahs, in doing tshuva. Sleep is only one example of being batel. That's the problem. It's not the sleep It's the failure to be engaged in prayer, tshuva, and Torah for those moments while you are asleep. Then the Eliyah Rabbah adds, Ayin Siman Tafkuf Tzadi Zayin Medin Leilech Benar. Take a look at what the Ramah says a few chapters later about going to the Nahar, going to the river, going to the body of water for Tashlich. What on earth does that have to do with anything? Why is he talking here about Tashlich? I intimated previously that the minhagim, the practices of the Ramah, and I distinguished between kum va'aseh, the minhagim of doing something, as opposed to minhagim of refraining from doing something. The positive minhagim, minhagei kum va'aseh, the minhagim of the Ramah, to go out and do something like the minhag of going to the river or going to the body of water for tashlich. That's a minhag kum va'aseh. That's a positive minhag, something you do, as opposed to something you don't do. The minhagim of the Ramah are consistently and universally leniencies, indeed, great leniencies, which hardly have anything to rely upon, but the people are actually doing it, and there is a source to justify the practice of the people, and therefore we will give our approval and allow the people to continue their practice, even though it is a great leniency and hardly has anything to rely upon. But there is a source, and in fact, the people are doing it, and we can let them continue doing that. We need not object to the practice. We can give it our seal of approval. Going to the river, going to the body of water for Tashlich on Rosh Hashanah, it's a great leniency. Not so easy to justify. What you're supposed to be doing is prayer, shofar, tshuva, engagement in Torah. And here the whole community gets together and goes out for the great social event of the year, and they all schmooze with their friends at the riverside. It's hard to justify. It's largely a waste of time. Waste of time in the sense that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing on Rosh Hashanah, namely engaged in tshuva and Torah and prayer. Instead, you're having a social event at the riverside. Very hard to justify, but there are sources, and in fact the people are doing it, and therefore we can smile on the practice of the people. What have we learned now? That the problem of sleeping, this Ashkenaz minhag to refrain from sleeping, it's not actually the sleep. It's being bottled. It's the downtime when you should be active in prayer. You should be active in doing tshuva. You should be active in your engagement in Torah. And sleep is a little bit of downtime, and that's what's wrong with it. Just like going to the river, that great social event on Rosh Hashanah afternoon. There's a little bit of downtime from what you're supposed to be doing in Rosh Hashanah. The people are doing it at the river. We can give our approval to that. Let's go one step further. The Eliyah Rabbah on the previous screen quoted the Magen Avraham. At this point, I want to look at the full text of the Magen Avraham, which he only quoted part of it. Let's look at the full text of the Magen Avraham, which the Eliyah Rabbah, he only gave us a snippet on the previous screen. The Ramah said, don't sleep. The Arizal, the great mystic of Tzfat, said that after midday, it's okay to sleep because your angel was already woken up by your prayers and the blowing of the shofar. The Bach quoted the practice of the Maharam of Rothenburg, who slept on every Yom Tov, including Rosh Hashanah. But Hayoshev Batel Kiyoshen Dami, someone who is wasting time on Rosh Hashanah is no better than someone sleeping, and therefore should also be avoided. Okay, now the whole basis of the Magen Avraham is the opinion of the great Arizal. Let us now look at the words of the Arizal. The truth is, we don't have the words of the Arizal. The truth is, the Arizal, the great mystic of Tzfat, never left us any writings. But he did have great disciples, and amongst his great disciples was Reb Chaim Vital, who wrote the Sefer Pre-Eitz Chaim that we're about to quote from. The disciples of the Arizal wrote down everything he said, and when people talk about the opinions of the Arizal, when people talk about the writings of the Arizal, they don't really mean stuff that the Arizal composed himself. What they mean is the writings of the disciples of the Arizal, who copied down everything that the Arizal said and reported everything that the Arizal did or didn't do. Let's see the quotation from the Pre-Eitz Chaim by the Arizal's great disciple, the Reb Chaim Vital. These are the words. Be'inyan Shena, as far as sleeping on Rosh Hashanah is concerned, near la'ani dati, it seems in my opinion, in my humble opinion, sheshamati memori, I heard my great teacher, the Arizal, say, Hatam, the reason not to sleep, because until the shofar is blown, you are asleep. You are spiritually asleep until the blowing of the shofar wakes you up spiritually. This is quite clear to us. Now, when you hear the blowing of the shofar, that's what wakes up your soul. Kamosh Katava Rambam. Rambam wrote this. Kitkiyo shofar, uru yeshenim mitardamaschem. The Rambam wrote, the blowing of the shofar is a wake-up call. It is the blowing of the shofar which wakes up the soul. You're spiritually asleep until you hear the shofar. Kvar be'arduan, as we've explained many times. Ad yom sheni nikra adayin yashen. As we've explained many times. You are spiritually dozing, you are spiritually torpid, you are spiritually a little bit asleep until the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Kavanatenu, we mean l'ororo, and therefore we want to wake you up, we want to make you spiritually aware. Lachein, therefore, Ra'ui shelo lishan b'Rosh Hashanah. That's the reason why you shouldn't sleep on Rosh Hashanah, because this is the time to wake yourself up, to spiritually, to wake yourself up. And if you're wasting time, and sleeping is only one example of wasting time, you're not engaged in waking up your neshama, waking up your soul. Lani Adati, in my humble opinion, it seems that I heard my great master, my great teacher, the Arizal, say, Ein ze ela ad chatzi hayom. All this has to do with the period of time up to midday. Ki achakach, because after midday, after astronomical midday, kvar nit orer al yedei musaf tkiyas, you've already finished musaf, the long tefillah of Rosh Hashanah, by far the longest tefillah of the year, is Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. You've already finished Musaf. You've already finished the Tkiyot, the blowing of the shofar. By midday, your soul has woken up already, and therefore sleep is okay. Ani ra'iti shu yashen achar chatzi hayom. I saw myself that my great master, the Arizal, used to take a nap on Rosh Hashanah afternoon. Okay, Up to this point, we've seen the reason to be strict, and we've seen the mystical reason to be lenient on Rosh Hashanah afternoon. In Yetz Hashem, next week we're going to continue this discussion and tie it up, finish with the opinions of contemporary rabbis. Until then, I wish you a good week, a safe week, and a good Shabbos. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Beautifully done.
You're very welcome.
Gracias, Rabino.
Welcome.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov u'Mivorach.
Thank you, Rabbi. Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov u'Mivorach u'Kulam. Shalom l'chol Beit Yisrael.